Hostas are the easiest plant in your garden for 11 months of the year. You plant them, you ignore them, they come back bigger every spring. But what happens when late July hits and five things start going wrong in your shade bed at the same time? 15 minutes this weekend, five tasks, and every hosta clump you own will look completely different by the second week of August. What does a hosta actually need from you in the last week of July? That depends on what is happening inside the plant right now, and there are five things going on simultaneously that you can address in one short weekend session. Cleaner foliage, bigger leaves next spring, more energy stored in the crown for winter, less slug damage overnight, and healthier roots heading into fall. Every one of those improvements starts with something you do this week. Right now, in late July, your hostas are at a turning point in their season. The explosive spring growth is finished. The leaves have been open and working for 3 full months, and some of them are starting to show it. Flower stalks are draining energy upward. Slugs have been feeding in the dark for weeks. The shade bed soil is drier than it looks on the surface. And the crown, hidden underground, is beginning the long process of storing energy for winter dormancy and next spring's emergence. Everything you do in the next 15 minutes either helps or ignores these five realities. So grab your garden shears, a soaker hose, and a bag of granular fertilizer, because here is exactly what to do and why each task matters. The first task is the one that sparks the most debate among hosta growers. And once you understand the biology behind it, you will know exactly where you stand. Your hostas are sending up tall flower stalks right now. Some are already blooming with pale lavender or white trumpet-shaped flowers rising above the foliage. Others are still in tight bud, the stalks pushing upward through the center of the clump and getting taller by the day. They look pretty. Pollinators love them. And you might be tempted to leave them alone and let the plant do its thing. Here is the trade-off happening inside the plant. A hosta in bloom diverts roughly a quarter of its total seasonal energy into flower and seed production. That is 25% of everything the plant manufactures through photosynthesis. All the sunlight it captures, all the sugars those big leaves produce, redirected away from the crown and root system and poured into making seeds you will never collect and never plant. The crown is the underground storage organ that determines how many leaves emerge next spring and how big each one grows. Every calorie that goes into seed production is a calorie that does not go into building next year's foliage display. Hosta growers, who remove every flower stalk, consistently report 15 to 25% larger leaves the following year compared to plants that were allowed to bloom and set seed. That difference in leaf size is visible. You can stand in front of a clump that was destalked and a clump that was not, and see the size difference in the leaves with your own eyes. Grab your shears and cut each flower stalk as low as you can reach into the clump, right where the stalk emerges from the crown. Do not wait for the flowers to finish. Do not wait for the stalks to brown. Cut them now while the plant is still pumping energy upward, and that energy immediately redirects downward into the crown and roots. Some clumps will have 3 or 4 stalks, others will have a dozen, depending on the variety and the size of the crown. Get every stalk in the clump, reach down into the foliage and find the base of each stalk where it connects to the crown, and make a clean cut with sharp bypass pruners or garden shears. The cut end will dry and seal within a day or two. You will notice how much cleaner the clump looks the moment the stalks are gone. Without those tall stems poking up and flopping over, the mound of foliage becomes the focal point again, which is exactly what you want from a shade garden anchor plant. The leaves are the show and the stalks were distracting from them. If you love the flowers and want to enjoy them for a few days first, that is completely fine. Cut them once they start to fade rather than letting them go to seed. The biggest energy drain happens during seed formation, not during bloom. So leaving the flowers open for a week and then cutting the stalks before seeds develop is a reasonable middle ground. Some gardeners bring the stalks inside and put them in a vase on the kitchen table. You get the flowers and the plant keeps its energy. That is a fair trade. This is where the real damage is happening to your hostas while you sleep. And the scale of it surprises almost everyone who goes outside with a flashlight after dark for the first time. Late July is peak slug season, and the reason slugs target hostas specifically is chemical. Hosta leaves produce a sugar compound in their tissue that slugs can detect from several feet away through moist night air. They are not wandering randomly through your shade garden and stumbling onto your hostas by accident. They are navigating directly toward the plants because the leaves are broadcasting a chemical signal that reads like a dinner invitation. Every hosta in your shade bed is essentially calling slugs toward it through the humid darkness. Walk out to your hosta bed in the morning and look at the leaves. If you see ragged, irregular holes chewed through the leaf centers, and if you can spot shiny slime trails on the soil surface or on the undersides of leaves, slugs are feeding every single night. The damage accumulates fast. A clump that looked healthy 2 weeks ago can be riddled with holes by mid-August if slugs are left unchecked. Scatter iron phosphate bait around the base of every hosta clump this week. The brand name you will see in every garden centre is Sluggo, and it works by disrupting the slug's feeding once ingested. Iron phosphate is safe for pets, for birds, for children, and for beneficial insects. It breaks down into iron and phosphate in the soil, both of which are nutrients your plants can use. Apply according to the package directions and reapply after any heavy rain, because rain dissolves the pellets. For severe infestations where you are seeing dozens of holes per leaf, add an evening hand-picking patrol. Go out around 10 at night with a flashlight and a bucket of soapy water. You will find slugs actively feeding on the leaf surfaces, and you can pick them off by hand and drop them into the bucket. One evening patrol during peak season can remove dozens of slugs from a single shade bed. The chewing damage stops immediately because you remove the animals doing it. Do this 2 or 3 nights in a row during a wet stretch, and you will break the cycle for the rest of the season. Another approach that works well as a permanent barrier is copper tape around raised beds or individual containers. Slugs avoid crossing copper because the metal reacts with their slime and produces a mild electrical sensation. A strip of copper tape around the rim of a pot or the top edge of a raised bed frame creates a perimeter that slugs will not cross. This works best for contained plantings where you can seal the entire border. For in-ground shade beds where you cannot create a sealed perimeter, the combination of iron phosphate bait plus 1 or 2 evenings of hand-picking is the most effective strategy available. Beer traps catch some slugs, but tend to attract more from neighboring areas than they eliminate. Bait and hand removal are faster and more thorough. Here is the long-term strategy that works alongside the bait. Thick-leaved hosta varieties produce less of the sugar compound that attracts slugs, and they have tougher leaf tissue that is physically harder for slugs to chew through. Varieties like Sum and Substance with its enormous chartreuse leaves, Blue Angel with its heavy blue-green foliage, and Halcyon with its thick powder blue leaves all experience measurably less slug damage than thin-leaved varieties. If slugs are a permanent problem in your shade garden year after year, gradually adding more thick-leaved varieties to your collection is a long-term solution that works at the genetic level. You are not just treating the symptom, you are changing the plant material itself. The next task takes about 5 minutes, and the results show up within a week, which makes it one of the most satisfying things you can do in the garden right now. Hostas growing in shade often get skipped during summer watering rounds because they are tucked under trees or along north-facing foundations, where the soil does not look dry the way a sunny perennial bed does. The surface may seem fine, but underneath, those big hosta leaves are transpiring enormous amounts of moisture through their leaf tissue every day, pulling water from the soil faster than you might expect for a shade plant. Push your finger about 2 inches into the soil right next to a hosta crown. If it feels dry at that depth, your shade bed needs water. Not a quick pass with the hose nozzle, but a real deep soak that penetrates down to where the roots are actively growing. Surface sprinkling is one of the most common watering mistakes with hostas in shade. A 5-minute spray wets the top inch and the leaf surfaces, but the water never reaches the feeder roots growing 6 to 8 inches below. The plant looks like it got watered, the root zone stays dry, and the wet leaves create exactly the conditions that fungal diseases need to spread. Set a soaker hose along the base of your hosta bed and let it run at a slow trickle for 30 to 45 minutes. If you do not have a soaker hose, set a sprinkler on its lowest setting and let it run long enough to saturate the soil several inches deep. The key is watering at the base of the plants, not over the top of the foliage. Wet hosta leaves sitting overnight in humid July air are an open invitation for fungal disease. Crown rot, leaf spot, and various mildews all thrive on leaf surfaces that stay damp through warm nights. Water the soil, not the leaves. Early morning is the best time if you have the choice because any moisture that lands on the foliage will evaporate as the air warms rather than sitting through the night. You can spot a drought-stressed hosta before the damage becomes permanent if you know what to look for. The leaf edges curl slightly inward, almost like the plant is trying to reduce its surface area to conserve water. The color dulls from its usual rich green or blue to a flatter grayish tone, and in more advanced cases, the leaves feel thinner and less substantial between your fingers than they should. All of these signs reverse within a few days of a deep soak, which is why this task produces the fastest visible results of any of the five. One deep soak this week produces visible results by next week. Hosta leaves that were starting to curl at the edges, turning slightly pale, or developing a dull texture from drought stress will firm back up and regain their color and gloss. The difference between a well-watered hosta clump and a slightly dehydrated one is obvious once you know what to look for, and the fix takes less than an hour of soaker hose time. That is 3 tasks covered, and your hostas are already in better shape than they were this morning. The Flower Gardener's Bible covers all 38 plants with a month-by-month care calendar, like this one, $9 at bloomrelay.co. Now look at each hosta clump with fresh eyes, because this next task is about editing what is already there. Every hosta clump in your shade bed has a few leaves right now that are past their prime. You know the ones, yellowing from the edges inward, chewed up by slugs from earlier in the season before you started treatment. Sun scorched on the tips from that one afternoon when the shade shifted and direct light hit them for 2 hours. Or just plain tired from 3 solid months of growth since they unfurled in April. Cut these individual leaves off at the base of their petiole, which is the stem connecting each leaf to the crown. Use clean, sharp shears and make a neat cut right where the stem meets the crown. Do not pull leaves off by hand, even if they look like they are ready to fall. Pulling can tear tissue from the crown itself and create a wound that invites bacterial rot in the warm, moist conditions of a late July shade bed. While you are down at leaf level, take a moment to look at the remaining healthy leaves for early signs of common hosta diseases. Circular brown spots with a slightly darker ring around the edge are anthracnose, a fungal leaf disease that spreads in humid conditions. Light tan patches between the leaf veins, especially on the outer edges, usually indicate sun scald from reflected light or from canopy loss where a branch above was recently removed. Neither of these conditions will kill the plant, but leaves that are more than half damaged are better removed than left to serve as a breeding ground for fungal spores that will spread to healthy foliage in August rain. If you see anthracnose on multiple leaves, clean your shears with rubbing alcohol between cuts to avoid carrying spores from one leaf to the next. Removing damaged foliage accomplishes 2 things that you can observe over the following weeks. First, it improves air circulation around the remaining healthy leaves. In the humid air of August, good airflow is the single best defense against fungal leaf diseases. A tightly packed clump with dead and dying leaves, pressed against healthy ones, traps moisture against the leaf surfaces and creates exactly the warm, still, damp environment that fungal spores need to germinate and spread. Removing the damaged leaves opens the clump up and lets air move through. Second, cutting away dying tissue redirects the plant's limited late-season energy toward leaves that are still photosynthesizing productively and toward the crown and root system that are actively storing reserves for next year. A leaf that is 70% yellow is barely producing any sugars through photosynthesis, but the plant is still sending water and nutrients to maintain whatever green tissue remains. Cutting that leaf removes the drain. Collect all the cut foliage and dispose of it rather than leaving it on the ground around the clump. Slug-damaged leaves on the soil surface become hiding spots for more slugs during the day, and diseased leaves left in contact with healthy foliage can reinfect the plant when rain splashes spores back onto new growth. A clean bed surface around each clump supports everything else you are doing this weekend. A hosta clump with 6 perfect leaves looks dramatically better than one with 6 perfect leaves and 4 tattered yellow ones dragging on the ground around the edges. The visual improvement is immediate, and the health benefit plays out over the following weeks as airflow improves and crown energy stops being wasted. If you are getting value from this and you grow shade plants, hit subscribe. There is a new video every week covering seasonal garden care, plant by plant problem solving, and the kind of practical advice that saves you from learning everything the hard way. This final task is about setting your hostas up for next spring, and the timing window is narrower than it looks on the calendar. Late July is the last good feeding window for hostas before the growing season winds down. From now through early September, the crown is actively banking energy reserves for winter dormancy and next spring's emergence. The size and vigor of the leaves that push up through the soil next April is determined in large part by how much energy the crown stores between now and the first hard frost. A well-fed crown produces bigger, bolder, more numerous leaves. An underfed one produces a thinner, weaker display. Scatter a balanced, slow-release granular fertilizer around the drip line of each hosta clump, which is the imaginary circle on the soil surface directly below the outermost edges of the leaves. This is where the actively growing feeder roots are concentrated, and placing the fertilizer here puts it directly where the roots can access it most efficiently. A 10-10-10 or 14-14-14 formulation works well for this late season feeding. You do not need a high nitrogen formula because you're not trying to push new leaf growth at this point. You want a balanced feed that supports root development and crown storage equally. Apply about a tablespoon per square foot of root zone for a medium-sized clump, or follow the rate on your specific product label. Water the granules in thoroughly after application so they begin dissolving into the soil rather than sitting dry on the surface where they could burn the crown. If you've been top dressing your hosta beds with compost every spring, your plants are already getting a slow baseline feed from the decomposing organic matter, and this granular application adds the concentrated minerals that compost alone may not supply in sufficient quantity. Do not use fast-release liquid fertilizer this late in the season. Liquid feeds deliver a quick spike of available nitrogen that pushes soft, tender, new growth from the crown. Any new leaves or shoots that emerge in August from a liquid feeding will not have enough time to mature and harden before the first frost hits in autumn. Soft growth freezes, collapses, and rots against the crown, which can introduce bacterial problems to the very storage organ you are trying to protect. Slow-release granular fertilizer avoids this entirely because it feeds steadily over weeks rather than dumping nutrients all at once. The granules dissolve gradually through August and September, delivering a consistent low-level feed during the exact window when the crown is actively storing reserves. One application this week is the last feeding your hostas need until next spring. After the end of August, the plant begins its natural transition toward dormancy, and additional fertilizer at that point does more harm than good. It pushes metabolic activity when the plant should be slowing down and preparing for winter. Feed now, water it in, and let the slow-release formula do its work through the remaining warm weeks. Those are your 5 tasks, and if you did all of them this weekend, your hosta bed is already healthier than it has been in weeks. But there are 2 things about hostas that rarely come up in gardening conversations, and both of them change how you think about these plants. The first one explains something you may have noticed without understanding why. Established hosta beds have fewer weeds than other shade plantings. Year after year, the soil between and around mature hosta clumps stays surprisingly clean compared to beds planted with ferns, astilbe, or other shade perennials. That is not an accident, and it is not because you are weeding better. Hostas produce natural allelopathic compounds through their root systems that suppress the germination of weed seeds in the surrounding soil. The plant is doing its own weeding underground through root zone chemistry. And here is the practical payoff. Every year your hosta clumps grow larger and the root systems expand, the weed-free zone around each clump gets bigger. Vigorous, well-fed hostas create their own low-maintenance zones. This is one more reason to keep your clumps healthy and growing rather than letting them stall or decline. A thriving hosta is not just prettier, it is actively reducing your weeding workload. The second fact catches almost everyone off guard. Hostas are edible. In Japan, they are called yurui, and the tightly furled spring shoots are harvested as a vegetable before they unfurl into leaves. The taste is similar to asparagus, mild and slightly sweet with a pleasant crunch, and they are considered a seasonal delicacy in Japanese cuisine. The shoots are blanched or sautéed in butter and served as a spring green, sometimes with a light soy or miso glaze. The harvest window is narrow, just a week or two in early April, when the shoots are still tightly curled and no more than 4 to 6 inches tall. Once the leaves begin to unfurl, the texture becomes tough and the flavor turns bitter. If you have a large hosta collection, you are sitting on a spring vegetable garden without knowing it. Harvesting a few shoots from each large clump in April does no harm to the plant as long as you leave plenty of growing points to develop into the foliage display. Not saying you need to eat your hostas, just saying you could. Before you walk away from the shade bed, do one more thing. Look at each hosta clump and check whether the center has become crowded. If you have clumps where the outer leaves are noticeably smaller than they used to be, and the interior of the mound is dense and congested, those clumps need division, and the window for it opens soon. Mark those clumps now, either with a stake or a note in your garden journal, because the ideal division window is early September. By then, the worst of the summer heat has passed, but the soil is still warm enough for new roots to establish before the ground freezes. Dig the entire clump by pushing a sharp spade in a circle about 4 to 6 inches outside the outermost leaf edges, then lever the whole root mass out of the ground. Shake or wash loose soil from the root ball so you can see the individual growing points, which look like tightly packed clusters of leaf bases emerging from the crown. Use a sharp spade, a heavy serrated knife, or a pair of back-to-back garden forks to split the clump into sections with at least 3 to 4 growing points each. Smaller divisions with only 1 or 2 points will survive but take longer to fill out into a substantial clump. Larger divisions with 6 or more points will look full faster but give you fewer total plants. 3 to 4 points per division is the sweet spot between speed and quantity. Replant each division at the same depth it was growing at before, in soil amended with a few inches of compost worked into the planting hole. Water deeply immediately after planting and keep the soil consistently moist for the first 2 to 3 weeks while new roots establish. Space divisions 18 to 24 inches apart for medium-sized varieties, or up to 36 inches apart for large varieties like Sum and Substance that need room to spread. Each division becomes a full-sized clump within 2 growing seasons. September division is easier on the plant than spring division for a specific reason. In September, the crown goes directly into dormancy after pushing a few new roots into the surrounding soil. It does not have to survive a full summer of heat and transpiration stress while simultaneously rebuilding a root system. Spring-divided hostas have to do both at once, and some divisions struggle through their first hot summer. September divisions skip that stress entirely. They root, they rest, and they come up strong the following April. Mark the crowded clumps now. Divide in 6 weeks. You will double your hosta collection and every division will perform better than the overcrowded parent clump was performing. 5 tasks, 15 minutes, and your shade garden looks better by August than it did when you walked out today. Cut the flower stalks to send that energy back into the crown. Scatter slug bait to stop the nightly feeding damage. Deep water the root zone so those big leaves have the moisture they need. Remove the tired, damaged foliage so the healthy leaves get full airflow and full energy. And feed one last time with slow-release granular to load the crown with reserves for next spring. 15 minutes in July is the difference between hostas that limp into fall looking ragged and hostas that carry strong, clean foliage all the way to the first frost. And the best part is that every one of these tasks compounds. The stalks you removed send energy to the crown, which the fertilizer you applied helps the crown store more efficiently, which the deep watering you gave supports by keeping the root system fully functional. The leaf cleanup improves airflow that protects the remaining healthy foliage, and the slug bait stops the nightly damage that was undoing your other efforts. 5 separate tasks, but they work together as one system. You planted hostas because they are supposed to be easy. for 11 months of the year they are, this is the 1 month you give back, and the payoff shows up in August. Which of your hostas needs the most help right now? Drop it in the comments. And if slugs are your biggest hosta problem, share what has worked in your garden. Because slug control is local, and what works in your climate helps every gardener watching from the same region.